Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the TBM crew. Today, I have the honor to have with me Ty Tracey, who's one of my favorite authors ever. How are you?
I'm well, thank you so much. And I should say I'm honored to be with the indomitable Mar Garcia. So what you do is unbelievable. And yeah, I can't, if somebody didn't do all of this stuff for all of us authors that can't do much of anything besides write, nobody
Oh,
would. So I really appreciate everything you do. It's
Ty,
amazing.
thank you so much. Well, everyone that knows me already on social media knows that your prior book, 3 Days in Ashford, is one of the best books I have ever read. This one.
Just happen to have a copy lying around. I have like 50 of them.
So we will talk about it. But before, we need to talk about your next release, right? You have something in the oven.
I do, yeah. Just it's called. Well, first off, I had a baby. She came home on July 4th. It was her Independence Day, we're calling it. So, yeah, I've definitely let it languish a little bit. Like, it's done. The book is written. It's done. It needs a little bit more editing. It's good enough in a pre-copy phase for some early readers, but I have to figure out a way to have time to get back and do that final edit and do the various publishing tasks, which Mars helped me out with. But yeah, the book is the best thing I've ever written. It's very easily the best thing I've ever written. It's way bigger in scope for those of you that have read 3 Days in Ashford.
Yes.
More like global events, end of the world type of stuff, post-apocalyptic stuff. It's good. My first sort of soiree into having a female protagonist, a female hero, Lori Cruz, and yeah, she's awesome. Some similarities with 3 Days in Ashford. It definitely is in that same kind of mythos as 3 Days in Ashford. Some of the stuff takes place in the same places. There'll be some surprises for folks that have read both of the books. Yeah, it's a monster too. I think I don't know how much it's going to be printed, but it's about twice as long as 3 Days in Ashford. So it's
then it's a big one.
Yeah, probably about 700-800 pages. I'm thinking in print. But yeah, the scope is huge. Bigger cast of characters, unlikely heroes. Really, the whole thing is a allegory for my feelings towards like civilization and the direction it's gone over the last like 5 years. It's called The Corroding.
Yes.
So hope we all like it.
I'm sure we will, because just to put a bit into context, because you're saying there's more stories, it's more complicated, it's more cast. Well, 3 Days in Ashford already was amazing. I mean, it seems that for someone who doesn't know or hasn't read 3 Days in Ashford, it seems that you're comparing it to a simple book. No. 3 Days in Ashford is already, yes, it's already an amazing, it's terrific. And it's already long compared to others, but I read it like in 2 days in a row.
Wow.
I mean, it doesn't matter that it's long. It's amazing. It's a roller coaster, and you change from one scene to another. The backgrounds are completely different. So it's you just read it. Just read it.
That's amazing.
Yes.
That's amazing. Thank you so much.
And it's so scary. It's so difficult to scare me. And it's very scary. I still think, I don't want to spoil it, but I still think of that floating thing, that.
Oh, right. Yes. Margaret. Yeah.
And still now, sometimes I think of it like,
just in your kid, like halfway between your kitchen, like something about being bridging between two rooms, I feel like made it scarier. Yeah, no doubt. And I remember specifically that scene in 3 Days in Ashford. My wife read it as well, and she was like, "I have to sleep in the same bed with you. Like, how do you come up with this crap?" Yeah, it's weird when you have to describe to somebody like, "Yeah, you write horror novels," and you're like, "I'm a pretty normal dude. Like, I write code for a living at work." And it's just, it's great to hear that. Like, I'm glad I scare people, but I definitely subscribe a little more to, like, both of these books, 3 Days in Ashford and The Corroding, are definitely a little bit of a departure from like kind of like the mainstream genre horror that you see now in like Coots and King, and it's probably a little bit more around like the H.P. Lovecraft cosmic sort of horror. Like, I definitely subscribe more to that brand a little bit more. I think there's a lot of scariness that in that genre to draw from. and not a lot of folks do. It's sort of like a techno thriller, cosmic horror type of stuff. So I dabble a lot in like spiritualism and just the sort of just existential struggle of humanity is what I like to try to write into it, because there's a lot of scary stuff going on right now. And a lot of that is in the corroding, because I'm not the kind of person that's going to go on social media and like, you know, air like my dirty laundry or my feelings about anything. I'm not political. I'm not on any political side. Like I've never been into politics at all whatsoever. So like what I do, healthy or unhealthy, is I just kind of internalize everything and then I write it into a book later on. And that's sort of my outlet. The corroding is sort of like my outlet for everything that we've seen go on, with a very scary element into it. The main antagonist is definitely one of the scariest things I've ever written. If you thought Margaret, the floating lady in 3 Days in Ashford was scary, I can't wait for you to meet Alistair Smoke.
Oh, so. I'm looking forward to it, really. And also 3 Days in Ashford also had this existential background, because at the end the story, it's just like a different rate of humanity and why we're here, why not, how everything is ruled, you know. Exactly. So maybe there's some kind of connection there.
No doubt, yeah. Like the 3 Days in Ashford was really like touched on like the origin story of humanity and like where we had come from, like where we, like, do you subscribe to like the religious view of things, the biological view of things, or this is kind of like offers you a third one with where they came from in 3 Days in Ashford. I won't give anything away, but like the whole thing had to be discovered and kind of unraveled through like the internal conflict of Daniel Hollowell, the main character, and he had to go through hell, for lack of a better term, to be able to unravel all that and figure it out, along with all of his friends. So yeah, it's definitely touches on that, and it's related in the corroding. It's a different take on the entire thing, but it's definitely related. It's I think if you like 3 Days in Ashford, you'll love the corroding. It's kind of one of those things.
I'm sure I will. I still have nightmares with that thing. Imagine.
Oh, I'm sorry. I hope it's nothing too bad.
It's your job. It's your job.
Yeah. Well, just remember, Margaret was just, you know, she was a normal person first, and then she ended up being that way. Yes. So maybe if you think of Margaret instead of as the floating thing, as the woman in the insane asylum, you're way better off.
Yeah. Yes. It's everything in 3 Days in Ashford has a double lecture, a double rate, because even when they start, that they go to that place, they don't even know what they're doing. Everything's like so skeptical and everything is weird, but they don't get to know what they are doing. And the scene with the melon head and all of that, I mean, it's everything. And I really think if you got to write something scarier than that, everyone needs to read this, even more the horror fans that they like psychological horror, because that's what it's at the end. You get in to turn the knife there in the little terrors you can feel, right?
Exactly. So, so it's kind of that slow burn. Like they're just a bunch of happy-go-lucky. This is 3 Days in Ashford. They're a bunch of like happy-go-lucky paranormal investigators, and they think they're just going like on a regular ho-hum investigation into this town that's like normal. They come to find out, like, via a very slow burn, like the town doesn't actually exist. It used to exist, and they're only being drawn there for a very specific sort of nefarious reason, and it's not good for any of them once they get there. And as that becomes more and more apparent, I think the dread ramps up. The corroding is very similar, sort of in a very different kind of thread. Our main sort of hero, Lori Cruz, she's like the best mind in the FBI from like a crime scene investigative competency standpoint. She's called in to investigate a real high-profile murder that's super grisly and way worse than anything you could ever imagine. I won't give anything away, but it's not good once she gets there. And she, for the first part of the book, thinks she's like, okay, there's some sort of a sicko killer out there that I have to go and figure out and go after. And as she starts to unravel her own mystery in the corroding, she starts to realize, wow, it's probably a lot bigger than just one person running around killing people. It's bigger than that. It's societal. It's gonna. There's implications that affect the entire civilization afoot that she has to go and figure out. And as she kind of bands up with the other folks in the book, the other band of characters. They start to unweave the entire thing.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Because in 3 Days in Ashford, one thing that happened to me that I guess that it will happen to more is that when you read about paranormal investigators, you think, yeah, I know, it's gonna go wrong. I know it's a horror book and it starts with that. It's gonna go very wrong. And they are also smarty pants, but you really don't know. I mean, yeah, it goes terribly wrong, but not in the direction that you think. Right? So I guess maybe you follow that pattern with The Corroding.
Yeah, definitely. Like in 3 Days in Ashford, they kind of got what they were looking for, but just in spades, like way too much. And like the fact that like I wrote Daniel Hallowell, who was like the main character in 3 Days in Ashford, the way I did, he was kind of a jerk. Like he was intentionally kind of a pompous dude that like thought like nothing was ever going to go wrong. I can handle everything. I'm a star. I have my own TV show, that kind of thing. And that really kind of added to the dynamic of like when things did go wrong for him, it was almost like, yeah, it's going wrong for him, but it's like the guy kind of made his own bed. He asked for it a little bit. So I think some folks found that interesting. When things go wrong in The Corroding, you kind of do feel it's darker. Like there's 3 Days in Ashford definitely have like a little bit of a comedic, like funny element to it with some of the stuff that I wrote.
Yes.
There's still that in The Corroding, but it's still darker because the things that are happening. Yeah, they're not only happening to the people, but the reason why it's so long is it's happening globally. It's the corroding of the entire earth is happening around them at all times. So like the backdrop of 3 Days in Ashford was sort of easy because there was just one town and the scope was limited, and there was creepy things happening around them. But trying to write into The Corroding, like the end of the world basically unraveling around them slowly. That takes a lot more typing, a lot more pages. So it's just a way bigger scope. And that's just the backdrop for what's going on with the main characters. But I hope I accomplished it. It was a challenge. It was the hardest thing about writing this book. Definitely was. The overall scope, I almost felt like I bit off more than I could chew a few times, but I think I got it at the end. A lot of editing. Excuse me.
Yeah.
A lot of editing.
I can imagine. Well, then they are really, they complement each other, because in 3 Days in Ashford, you have this creepy town kind of, right, weirdness going on. And in the new one, there's completely the opposite. And have you always had this kind of writing, this tone, or how was your first steps in the writing world?
Oh, sure. Yeah, like my first book that I ever wrote, I've kind of always followed the same like sort of Chicago style writing technique. I came up sort of like, I read a lot of Stephen King. I read a lot of Dean Koontz. I think writing starts with reading. I read a lot more than I watch TV or movies or anything like that. So
that's good.
But at the same time, I've read a lot of like pretty much everything by Lovecraft. I read a lot of Cormac McCarthy. Like I feel like a lot of my writing technique comes from like a Cormac McCarthy, like Blood Meridian, for instance. Like I think you'll see elements of that in The Corroding. Sort of like the way that he starts chapters, like in The Corroding, I kind of I don't want to say stole it from him, but like the way that he sets the scene. He sets the scene of a chapter before he actually gets back into like whatever's going on with the main characters. And that was almost necessary in this because the scope, like I said, was so big. So what I think you'll find interesting about this is if you read it is every chapter, like the first 10 chapters have like a scene setting, and that's sort of like where I handle a lot of the end of the world stuff that's happening around it. I'm setting the scene, the background scene, then I go into like what's going on with the main characters. And one of those actually mentions 3 Days in Ashford. So it's a lot of strange things that's like one of those little blurbs, like there's like 5 blurbs at the beginning of each chapter that's like weird things that are happening around the world. Like there's a library in Colorado at one point that keeps finding like empty sanitized pepper sauce bottles in the stacks of books, and nobody has any idea where they're coming from. So just weird stuff like that. And like one of those little blurbs mentions Ashford being missing, a neighboring town being missing something. It kind of ties it in there, but
that's so cool.
Oh, thank you. When I first started, like the first book I wrote was called Iron Midnight, and it was about a bomb that the U.S. government was building. It was like a paranormal bomb that they were planning to drop on their enemies that would, like, when they exploded it would haunt the living hell out of wherever they blew this thing up. And I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't write an outline. I just started writing the novel. I had no idea what I was doing. I wrote the whole thing and I read it and it was crap. It was the worst thing. It was not even worth self-publishing. I didn't want to put my name on it. but I still have the manuscript, and yeah, I still at some point I kind of like the premise, but yeah, I might go back, but it would be a full blown rewrite. So like, I think that lesson early on, just writing an entire novel and having it fail like that, yeah, it's terrible, and it's a bad thing to have to go through. But I learned so much. Like I learned that like there's a process you kind of have to go through. You got to have at least an idea as to what you're writing. You can go into the manuscript and start writing the manuscript. It's sort of like the Anne Rice style of writing, where she just writes. There's no outline or anything like that. For me, I have to at least plot it out in at least a rough outline of like what's going to happen before I start filling it in to produce an actual manuscript out of it. And I learned that about myself the hard way by writing Iron Midnight. Someday I'll regret it and get it out. There's some scary parts of that book too. I just wish I had not incorporated them into such a crappy manuscript. But 3 Days in Ashford came out of that experience, and I won a couple of awards, and I applied all the lessons I learned from Iron Midnight to 3 Days in Ashford, and I think it definitely helped. Like as tough as it was to waste like 2.5 years writing a book that I was never going to publish, it led to 3 Days in Ashford. So there's definitely a silver lining to all of it, and The Corroding, which I think is definitely the creme de la creme of Ty Tracey writing.
And I wonder, even in your mind, how do you organize all the little plots that you put together in the book? Because 3 Days in Ashford is a really complex book. I mean, there's a lot of things colliding together. And how do you, when you start thinking of this book, you already have that structure in your mind, or it just pops up now this could be this, or how do you do it?
Yeah, it's definitely a lot. Oh sure, it's a lot of organization. It's tough, like especially like you mentioned 3 Days in Ashford. It's tough. It was tough in that book because I knew I was going to have to separate the characters at some point in the middle of it. When Dan Hollowell runs off in the middle of the book and it leaves all the rest of the characters at Lance's house, I knew I was going to have to tell both sides of that story in some fashion. So I had to sort of manufacture a way to do that. And I decided to do that through deposition. Like Daniel Hollowell was off. It was still telling that like first person side of his story. But at the same time, Ricky was being deposed by the sheriff and the judge of the county to figure out like what happened after the fact. So it's tough because you have to be able to like track that like chronologically. Like you can't have Ricky telling something that's going to happen to Danny before it happens, and it all has to sort of line up at the same time. So like that's where I think, at least in my case, like a rough outline helps a lot. A character reference helps a ton. Like one thing that I've always written alongside of any novel I've written is a character reference, because instead of having to use your brain constantly to remember like what are these, like who is this character, what are his mannerisms, what does he look like, how does he speak, that kind of thing. You can always just go back and reference it, the character reference that you read up front, and know like, oh yeah, Ricky is kind of a younger guy, dark hair. He's like Joe Cool. He wears black t-shirts and jeans.
Yes.
He does well with the ladies, that kind of thing. And then whereas like, then I have to shift context over to Daniel Hollowell, who's more of an older gentleman, a little bit of an asshole. He's definitely pompous, a little bit full of himself, but he is the main character that has to go through this whole ride.
Yes.
So it's tough. There's definitely organizational ways you can do it. I've read a lot of Michael Crichton as well. He jumps around a lot like that, from like timelines to timelines and scenes to scenes.
Yeah.
It helps. That is the way that you organize a book helps as well. Like you have to decide upon that kind of early, at least I do, in order to like here's how my chapters are going to work. I'm going to break it up by like one character's experience, the next character's experience. The Corroding is an interesting way that I handle that as well. Like prior to all the main characters sort of getting together, they all have their own chapters. So it's like they're all going through their own sort of journeys. You have like Keenan Ray, who's a mathematician out of Minneapolis, who's going to help Lori later on. You obviously have Lori Cruz, the FBI investigator, who's the main protagonist. You have a couple of kids from MIT, Dimitri Isabella and Andy Weber, and they're both just like pot smoking, nerdy computer scientist kids. That they really bring in a little bit of, and their professor comes along, and they're very, very integral to the story and how things come out, and you wouldn't expect that generally. But they're definitely just like nerds, and they come up with like the comedic element. They're like that coder part of me, like the nerdy sort of like software engineer kind of part of me. And they all, like prior to them coming together, they all have kind of their own chapters that tell like their own journey as to like what's going on with them, what they've discovered with respect to the corroding that brings them all into the same group alongside of Lori. Lori is definitely like the alpha of the group once they do get together. But once they do get together, it's all just basically your normal third person story because they're all together and you don't have to tell their individual stories.
Yeah.
But just decide upon how you want to organize things, know your characters. Knowing your characters is huge. And you have to develop them to the point where people care about them, especially in horror. You don't develop your characters to the point where people care about them and then bad things happen to them later. Nobody cares. It's way better.
Or become the psychopath.
Exactly, right.
And then you're in the side of the psychopath.
Right, exactly. No doubt. And
which happens to me a lot.
Yeah, right. And he's sort of right. I hope not. Who am I on this phone call with? It's fun. Like if you develop a character and people actually care about them emotionally, and then something terrible happens to them, it's way better. It's way more of a response. You know, it's
and we get upset with the writers.
Yeah, right. I've read books where you don't care what happens to somebody, and they get killed or whatever, and it's like good. Who cares? Like at least I don't have to read about that guy anymore.
Yeah, exactly. But that's what you say when the character is very developed and you just care for them. Like if you knew them or they were talking to you about someone in your real world. So it's happened to me a couple of times that I got very upset when they kill someone. And in one book, he was the psychopath. And I got so upset when they killed him. Yes.
That's awesome. I've always wanted to try to write a book through the eyes of the actual antagonist. Like I think that's a talent I'm not sure I have. I'd like to try my hand at it, but it's tough because the problem with that is if you were say you're writing a book about a serial killer, I've always wanted to write a book about an arsonist from his point of view.
Yes.
And I think that would be really interesting and really weird, but there's only so much of the craziness you can stuff into a book. You have to have other people, the people that are after him, you have to also show their point of view. But do you do that? Do you shift and do that from their point of view completely, or do you do it through the eyes of the actual psychopath? That's what I've always struggled with.
Yeah.
Because what would the psychopath think of people chasing him? I don't know. There might be that.
Criminal Minds has a lot of stuff about that. It's
really?
inspiration.
Yeah, watch it. I should totally watch
I love
that.
Criminal Minds.
Nice.
But I think they give too many ideas to psychopaths.
Probably, yeah. They're just making it they're nerfing it for all the psychopaths out there. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And it's the bad guy. It's always the guy of the TV. The one that fixes the wires. It's always that guy.
Yeah. Next time you look out your window and there's a guy messing with wires outside, just lock your doors.
Yeah.
Close your windows. Yeah.
Exactly.
Near that person.
Yes, it seems a joke, but from watching that, you're like, you're careful with a lot of things.
Right. Close your blinds. Exactly.
Yes. And in that show, they make you care for a lot of the psychopaths because they tell you the background. So, and all of them have crazy moms, all of them. So when you know the story, you think, of course he's killing people everywhere. I mean, Right.
Yeah. Yeah, this guy went through hell. What do you want him to do? Exactly.
It's justified. Just go.
Those are the scariest. I watched a lot about. There was a documentary I watched on Netflix.
Yes.
A while ago about Ted Bundy, and just how depraved that guy was, but at the same time how well he could carry himself, in society.
Yes.
The duality of that is, I think it's terrifying. That's what terrifies me. It's that he could have just been any old dude at the grocery store.
Exactly.
Ted Bundy. And you would have probably gotten along with him. If you talk to him.
It can be anyone.
Just behind closed doors, you're never going to find a crazier son of a bitch than that guy. It's unbelievable.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So that's scary to me, is that people can a person like that can hide it so well is nuts. That's weird.
Yes, exactly. And I was thinking, because with all the experience you have building these complex plots and all of this, which would be your greatest advice for new authors? Like you said, that you have learned and from your mistakes, if you had to advise someone, What would you say?
From like an indie author standpoint, I think like my biggest advice as a writer would be whatever you're writing came from you, and it's amazing because it came from you. And one way or the other, even if nobody ever buys it and not a single person reads it, it's always going to be a part of your legacy. Like it's always going to be on your shelf someplace in your house. Your grandchildren are going to be able to read it. It's like, I think a lot of writers that I've talked to at least are like, I can't sell any books, or Amazon's taking all of my money, which is not untrue. It's frustrating, no doubt. But like when you really take that kind of 10,000 foot view approach of like, yeah, it doesn't matter. You still wrote something, and not a lot of people are capable of doing that. And it's, whatever it is, it's amazing because it came from you.
Yeah.
I think that would be a good bit of advice. From more like a mechanical set of advice, as a writer,
it's great.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, because it will stay once we're gone too. It's kind of like with art.
Right.
And maybe
it's not going anywhere.
Exactly. And maybe the fact that no one, or you sell a few books or people don't read it, maybe they will in time. You never know. It's always going to be there.
Yeah, exactly. Look at H.P. Lovecraft. I mean, he had to die before anybody read any of his books.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he sold a few, but he pretty much lived in poverty his entire life.
Like all great artists. Yeah. It seems that all the artists, it seems that they wouldn't have became so famous if while they were alive, haven't been poor and miserable and died young. It's part of the right.
Yeah, exactly. Like you got to be like, if you come from humble beginnings, definitely it's interesting. Like if you're trying to like make a career out of writing initially, and that's all you're trying to do, God bless you, because it's so expensive at every step, especially if you're going the self-publishing route.
Yes.
Just getting anything edited is expensive. And I think keeping it in that perspective of, yeah, I still produced a book. That's amazing. It's an amazing accomplishment for any human being to do. It helps me a lot to remind myself of that. Just from a more mechanical sort of set of advice, I think you got to do a lot of research. If you're writing like something like 3 Days in Ashford the Corroding, that touches on a lot of different like complicated subjects. Like 3 Days in Ashford was a lot about spiritualism, a lot about like the origins of humanity. There's a ton of stuff that I had to do a lot of research on, a lot about the human brain. Believe it or not, I've read thousands of pages about just how the brain works for the corroding and that kind of stuff. But like if you don't do the research, somebody's going to read your book and be like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. He's trying to like cite these scientific things that he doesn't know what he's talking about. Like there's a whole scene in The Corroding where a guy's suffering from radiation poisoning, a pretty bad case of it. And it's a gruesome, horrible scene that I think is going to scare a lot of people. But at the same time, it's scary because I've done the research and I've actually looked into what happens to the human body when they suffer from radiation poisoning. Yeah. So like, I think that like if you want to make something really scary, make it scary but not untrue. Yeah. I think that's some of the best advice I can give you. Like that's really what would happen, and it's terrifying. So I think because that can actually happen, it's scarier in that way. It's not just pure fiction scary.
Yes, because sometimes when something is too magical, so to speak, sometimes you're reading a book and the situation is a dead end. It's not, and they just solve it with that makes no sense.
And there's no sort of explanation as to why it happened or where it came from, or that kind of thing. Like I think of like I love It. Like Stephen King's It is obviously like one of the greatest books of all time. Yes. And like obviously like Pennywise and It is like the destroyer of worlds, but it sort of leaves it open-ended as to like the whole like where did this thing come from? Why is it here? Like these kids in Derry dealt with this thing for every 80 years for all time, but it never really goes into like the science of it, why it was living in the sewer, where it came from, that kind of stuff. So it's like, I wish I had a little bit more. I mean, I know it was like a 1,600 word book or page book, but maybe a little bit of the origin would have been nice in there. That kind of thing.
Yes, I know the feeling. Yes, that sometimes you understand because you say, well, you're finishing the book. I mean, I understand they didn't want to start all over.
Right, exactly. Yeah. just like add like 10 more chapters that explain everything, right? And
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so
there's a counter argument, like you shouldn't have to explain everything, I guess. Like I don't want to be, I don't want people to get that think that the wrong way. It's like you, as a horror writer, you're not writing science fiction. You shouldn't have to explain everything. I just choose to because I think it makes it scarier.
Yes, exactly, because it's realistic. It could happen.
Right. Yeah. Theoretically, it could happen. Exactly.
Yes.
Like Prey by Michael Crichton's a good one. He wrote it like 10, 15 years ago, where there's this facility in like the desert in the Southwest, and all these nanoparticles get together and start killing people. And then like literally 5 years later, you start like reading articles that are coming out about nanoparticles like banding together. They're not killing people, but they're doing other things. But like you read Prey, then it's like, wow, this could really actually happen. This wasn't this scary before. It was science fiction, and now it's like kind of science fact, and it's definitely ramped up in the creepiness.
Yes. If I'm already scared with your floating thing, imagine with the realistic ones.
Exactly. Yeah. Imagine when you actually see that thing in your kitchen. No doubt.
Okay, we ran out of time. It's so lovely to talk to you.
Lovely to talk to you as always, Mar. Like anytime you want to chat, I'm always
thank
available.
you so much for your time. And we need to make a new one once you have your book out. So, and I have read it, and I know more things.
Oh, you've read The Corroding already?
Not yet.
Oh no! Oh, my first book. Yeah, totally. Oh, yeah. That's awesome. Well, yeah, Mar, like once again, you are unbelievable. You are magic. Thank you for everything you do. And yeah, I can't thank you enough. I love the fact that you are a Ty Tracey fan. And
number one. Well, maybe number two.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, hopefully we can keep cranking out more books, and I just got to find the time with the new baby. Exactly. So
now you have a new adventure there. You have to enjoy it so much.
I'm gonna write the kids book is next for Penelope, the new baby. So
it's mandatory.
The most terrifying children's book of all time.
Halloween book for kids.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, then thank you so much.
Thank you, Mar,
for your time. Take care and have a lovely day. We'll talk soon.
You too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.